Have you ever noticed that the most profound works of art, the compositions that move us to tears, the paintings that leave us breathless, the stories that change how we see the world, almost invariably emerge from experiences of deep suffering? Look closely at the lives behind humanity's greatest creative achievements, and you'll discover a striking pattern: profound pain transformed into profound beauty. The Greek tragedies that still captivate us after thousands of years weren't born from contentment and ease, but from a civilization grappling with the darkest aspects of human experience. Van Gogh's swirling night skies emerged from the chaos of his tormented mind. Bach's most transcendent compositions were written after the death of his wife. Time and again, we see this mysterious alchemy at work: suffering transmuted into something beautiful, meaningful, even redemptive. But this pattern raises a profound question. Why should pain and beauty be so intimately connected? Why does human suffering so often serve as the catalyst for our most magnificent creations? The conventional wisdom tells us that suffering is something to avoid at all costs, an unfortunate deviation from how life should be. We're encouraged to overcome hardship, to return to comfort and ease as quickly as possible. And yet, the evidence suggests something more complex is happening, that suffering itself might play an essential role in the creative process, that our pain might contain within it the seeds of a deeper understanding. Friedrich Nietzsche, perhaps more than any other philosopher, recognized this mysterious connection. From his first major work, The Birth of Tragedy, to his final writings, he explored how the experience of suffering could be transformed into artistic creation. "One must learn to dance upon the volcano of life," he wrote, capturing in this vivid image the strange relationship between danger and beauty, between suffering and creative expression. This insight wasn't abstract theory for Nietzsche. His life was marked by chronic illness, isolation, and eventual mental breakdown. He knew intimately what it meant to suffer, and yet, from this suffering emerged some of the most profound philosophical insights of the modern era. He didn't merely endure his pain. He transformed it into a body of work that continues to illuminate human experience more than a century after his death. What Nietzsche discovered was something both counterintuitive and deeply liberating: that tragedy, genuine encounter with the painful aspects of existence, isn't merely something to overcome on the way to happiness. It is itself a potential source of meaning, beauty, and heightened awareness. He wrote, "To see tragedy and to find joy in it, that is the highest achievement of humanity." This statement challenges our entire conventional understanding of suffering and its place in human life. But there's something more here, something that has been systematically overlooked or misunderstood in our culture's approach to pain. What if your suffering isn't a punishment or a mistake? What if it isn't something that has gone wrong with your life, but rather an invitation to engage more deeply with existence? What if, as Nietzsche suggested, the path to your most meaningful creation passes directly through your darkest experiences? Could it be that what we've been taught to avoid at all costs, vulnerability, uncertainty, pain, is actually the raw material for our most profound transformations? What if your suffering isn't the enemy of your creativity, but its essential catalyst? There's a striking contradiction in how our culture approaches suffering and creativity. On one hand, we celebrate art that emerges from pain, music born of heartbreak, literature shaped by trauma, visual art that confronts the darkest aspects of human experience. We're drawn to these expressions, recognizing in them a depth and authenticity often missing from more light-hearted creations. On the other hand, our dominant cultural narratives frame suffering as nothing but an obstacle to be eliminated, a problem to be solved, a deviation from how life should be. Our self-help literature, our medical paradigms, even many of our spiritual traditions focus primarily on alleviating pain, returning us to comfort and normalcy as quickly as possible. We're encouraged to get over our suffering rather than to engage with it creatively. This contradiction becomes particularly evident when we examine how we respond to artists who channel their pain into their work. We admire their creations, but often pathologize their suffering. Van Gogh's paintings hang in the world's finest museums, but we reduce his torment to a psychiatric diagnosis. Sylvia Plath's poetry moves us deeply, but we see her struggles only as illness, rather than as the source of her unique vision. The anomaly becomes clearer still when we look at how contemporary culture approaches creativity itself. The modern creative industries have attempted to systematize and sanitize the creative process to make it predictable, efficient, and painless. Creativity is repackaged as a series of techniques that can be learned in weekend workshops, practiced during office brainstorming sessions, or developed through structured exercises. Yet the evidence suggests something very different about the relationship between suffering and creation. Time and again, we see that our most profound creative breakthroughs emerge not from comfort and security, but from disruption, challenge, and often pain. The pattern is consistent across domains, from the arts to scientific discovery, from philosophical insight to spiritual awakening. Nietzsche recognized this pattern with extraordinary clarity. In The Birth of Tragedy, he explored how the ancient Greeks created their greatest art precisely by confronting the most terrifying aspects of existence. Rather than turning away from suffering, they transformed it into the structured beauty of tragic drama. This wasn't escapism or mere entertainment. It was a profound engagement with life's painful realities, transfigured through artistic form. What makes this insight so anomalous is that it runs counter to our most basic assumptions about what makes for a good human life. We've been conditioned to believe that well-being means the absence of pain, that success means avoiding failure, that mental health means freedom from disturbance. But what if these assumptions have led us fundamentally astray? What if, as Nietzsche suggested, the most spiritual human beings, assuming they are the most courageous, also experience by far the most painful tragedies? This alternative perspective suggests something revolutionary. That suffering isn't a mistake in the human experience, but an integral aspect of it. Not something to be merely overcome, but something to be transformed through creative engagement. As Nietzsche wrote, "Only great pain is the ultimate liberator of the spirit. Only great pain, that long, slow pain that takes its time, compels us philosophers to descend into our ultimate depths." The anomaly that emerges from this investigation is profound. What we've been taught to avoid at all costs may be precisely what enables our deepest creative expression. What we've learned to pathologize as disorder might actually be the necessary chaos from which new order emerges. What we've been encouraged to medicate away might contain within it the seeds of our most meaningful contributions. Could it be that in our rush to eliminate suffering, we've inadvertently closed ourselves off from one of the most powerful sources of human creativity and meaning? To understand how Nietzsche arrived at his revolutionary insights about suffering and creativity, we must examine the specific circumstances of his life and thought. Born in 1844 in Prussia, Friedrich Nietzsche's early life was marked by tragedy. When he was only 4 years old, his father, a Lutheran pastor, suffered a mental breakdown and died a year later. This early encounter with suffering and death would shape Nietzsche's intellectual journey from the beginning. As a young man, Nietzsche showed extraordinary academic promise, becoming the youngest person ever appointed to a chair of classical philology at the University of Basel at the age of just 24. His early academic work focused on ancient Greek culture, particularly the relationship between two opposing artistic impulses he identified: the Apollonian, representing order, rationality, and individuation, and the Dionysian, representing chaos, ecstasy, and the dissolution of boundaries. This analysis wasn't merely scholarly for Nietzsche. It reflected a tension he experienced in his own life between intellectual discipline and emotional intensity, between structured thought and chaotic feeling. In his first major work, The Birth of Tragedy, 1872, he explored how the ancient Greeks had created their highest art by bringing these opposing forces into productive tension, particularly in tragic drama, which confronted the most terrible aspects of existence while transforming them into beautiful, meaningful form. But perhaps the most significant catalyst for Nietzsche's understanding of suffering and creativity came from his own physical condition. Beginning in his late 20s, he was plagued by debilitating health problems, severe migraines, nausea, and deteriorating eyesight that sometimes left him unable to read or write for days or weeks at a time. By age 35, his health had deteriorated so severely that he was forced to resign from his academic position. What makes Nietzsche's approach to his suffering so remarkable is that he refused to see it merely as an obstacle to his work. Instead, he incorporated it into his philosophical project, using his own physical pain as a laboratory for understanding the human condition more broadly. In a letter to a friend during this period, he wrote, "My existence is a terrible burden. I would have abolished it long ago had I not been making the most instructive tests and experiments in spiritual and moral matters precisely in this state of suffering." This wasn't mere stoic endurance. Nietzsche was actively transforming his suffering into philosophical insight, using his pain as the raw material for his creative work. In The Gay Science, written during a period of slightly improved health, he declared, "I doubt that such pain makes us better, but I know that it makes us deeper." This depth, this increased capacity for understanding life in all its complexity, was for Nietzsche the true value that could be extracted from suffering. Another crucial influence on Nietzsche's thinking came through his complex friendship with the composer Richard Wagner. Initially idolizing Wagner, Nietzsche was drawn to the composer's ambitious attempt to create a total work of art that would unite music, drama, and mythic elements. Wagner seemed to embody the creative genius who could transform the chaotic Dionysian energies into structured artistic expression. But as Nietzsche's thinking evolved, he came to see Wagner's approach as ultimately a form of escapism, using art not to confront the tragic reality of existence, but to flee from it into mythic fantasy. Their eventual falling out reflected a crucial development in Nietzsche's understanding. True artistic transformation of suffering didn't mean escaping from reality, but engaging more deeply with it. By the time Nietzsche wrote Thus Spoke Zarathustra, 1883 to 1885, he had developed a fully formed philosophy of creative suffering. Through the character of Zarathustra, he proclaimed, "The Creator seeks companions, not corpses or herds or believers. The Creator seeks fellow creators, those who inscribe new values on new tablets." This image of writing new values on new tablets captures precisely what Nietzsche understood as the artistic transformation of suffering, not merely enduring pain, but using it as the catalyst for creating new meaning. Nietzsche's own creative process exemplified this approach. He wrote in short, intense bursts when his health permitted, transforming his physical suffering and psychological isolation into some of the most profound philosophical insights of the modern era. But what specific evidence supports this connection between suffering and creativity that Nietzsche identified? The evidence for Nietzsche's understanding of how suffering transforms into creativity begins with his analysis of ancient Greek tragedy in The Birth of Tragedy. Through careful examination of works by Aeschylus and Sophocles, Nietzsche observed something remarkable. These plays didn't shy away from depicting the most terrible aspects of human experience: murder, incest, madness, the arbitrary cruelty of fate. Yet through the structured beauty of tragic form, these horrors were transformed into something meaningful and even life-affirming. As Nietzsche wrote, "It is only as an aesthetic phenomenon that existence and the world are eternally justified." This statement isn't mere aestheticism. It points to something profound about how artistic creation can transform our relationship to suffering. The Greek tragedies didn't eliminate or deny the terrible aspects of existence. They transfigured them into an experience that could be faced directly, even affirmed as part of the totality of life. Nietzsche found further evidence in the lives and works of those artists he most admired. In Shakespeare, he recognized a creator who unflinchingly portrayed the darkest aspects of human nature, while transmuting them into the beauty of poetic language. In Beethoven, particularly in his later works composed after the onset of deafness, Nietzsche heard the transformation of personal suffering into transcendent music. These examples convinced him that the connection between suffering and creativity wasn't coincidental, but essential. Perhaps the most compelling evidence came from Nietzsche's own experience. In Ecce Homo, his intellectual autobiography written shortly before his mental collapse, he reflected, "My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati. That one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely bear what is necessary, but love it." This love of fate wasn't passive resignation, but active creation, the transformation of whatever life brings, including suffering, into something one can affirm. The pages of Nietzsche's personal letters provide further evidence of this transformative approach to suffering. Writing to his friend Peter Gast in 1881, he described how his physical pain had become integrated into his philosophical work. "My health is still variable, but the meaning and value of my existence lie precisely in the fact that I can derive more from sickness than most healthy people could derive from their health. I owe to my sick years my philosophy, and my healthy years merely gave me the leisure to develop and work it out." This testimony is particularly significant because it comes from Nietzsche's lived experience, not merely theoretical speculation. He wasn't writing about suffering from a position of comfort and security, but from within the experience itself, showing how it could be actively transformed into creative insight. Additional evidence appears in Nietzsche's writing style itself. His works are not dry academic treatises, but passionate, often poetic expressions that channel emotional intensity into precisely crafted language. The aphoristic form he favored, short, concentrated bursts of insight, reflected the conditions of his suffering, as he could only write during brief periods when his health permitted. Yet these constraints became the catalyst for a uniquely powerful literary style, one that continues to move readers more than a century after his death. Even Nietzsche's famous declaration that God is dead can be understood as evidence of his approach to creative suffering. This wasn't merely a rejection of religious belief, but a recognition of the profound spiritual crisis of the modern era. Rather than turning away from this crisis or seeking easy consolation, Nietzsche insisted on facing it directly and creating new values in response to it. As he wrote in The Gay Science, "Indeed, we philosophers and free spirits feel, when we hear the news that the old God is dead, as if a new dawn shone on us. At long last, our ships may venture out again. The sea, our sea, lies open again. Perhaps there has never yet been such an open sea." This metaphor of the open sea perfectly captures Nietzsche's understanding of how suffering can become the starting point for new creation. The death of God, representing the collapse of traditional meaning structures, isn't merely a tragedy to be lamented, but an opportunity for new navigations, new discoveries, new creations. But if the connection between suffering and creativity is so well supported by evidence, why has this understanding been so consistently overlooked in our approaches to both art and suffering? To understand the depth of Nietzsche's insight about suffering and creativity, we must examine how this transformative process actually works. What mechanisms allow pain to become art? How exactly does suffering catalyze creative expression? Nietzsche's writings, particularly when examined alongside contemporary understandings of psychology and neuroscience, reveal several key elements of this process. First, suffering disrupts our habitual patterns of thought and perception. When everything is comfortable and familiar, we tend to operate on autopilot, following established neural pathways and conventional ideas. Pain breaks this pattern, forcing new perspectives. As Nietzsche wrote in Daybreak, "All prejudices come from the intestines," a colorful way of suggesting that our most deeply held assumptions often remain unexamined until physical or emotional pain disrupts them. This disruption creates the conditions for what neuroscientists now call neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new connections and pathways. Suffering essentially forces us to think differently, because our old patterns no longer suffice to navigate our changed circumstances. What Nietzsche intuited, modern neuroscience confirms. Cognitive breakthroughs often follow periods of disruption and discomfort. Second, suffering intensifies our experience. Pain, whether physical, emotional, or existential, demands our full attention. It cuts through the numbness and distraction that characterize much of modern life, bringing us into immediate contact with raw reality. Nietzsche recognized this quality when he wrote in The Gay Science, "In pain, there is as much wisdom as in pleasure. Like the latter, it is one of the best self-preservatives of a species. This wisdom comes precisely from the heightened awareness that suffering brings." This intensification explains why art born of suffering often possesses a depth and resonance that more superficial creations lack. The artist who creates from pain isn't working with abstract concepts or conventional forms, but with the most vivid and immediate aspects of human experience. As Nietzsche observed, "We have art in order not to die of the truth." suggesting that artistic creation allows us to bear an intensity of reality that might otherwise be overwhelming. Third, suffering creates a need for meaning that casual contentment never does. When we're comfortable, we rarely question the purpose or significance of our existence. Pain forces these questions to the surface. Nietzsche captured this dynamic in his famous statement, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." The search for this why often leads to creative expression as we struggle to articulate and make sense of our most difficult experiences. This need for meaning-making explains why periods of cultural flourishing often follow times of crisis and upheaval. After World War I, the Dada movement emerged directly from the trauma of mechanized warfare. The Harlem Renaissance developed in response to the oppression and violence of American racism. In each case, collective suffering created an urgent need for new forms of expression and meaning. Fourth, suffering reveals dimensions of experience that remain invisible in states of comfort and security. Pain brings us into contact with our vulnerability, our mortality, our deepest fears, aspects of existence that our everyday consciousness tends to avoid or deny. Nietzsche believed that confronting these difficult truths was essential for creating art of genuine depth and significance. As he wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, the spiritual human being, assuming they are the most courageous, also experience by far the most painful tragedies. But it is precisely for this reason that they honor life, because it brings its greatest opposition against them. This revelatory quality explains why tragic art often feels more true than purely pleasant or entertaining creations. It doesn't shy away from the difficult aspects of human experience, but incorporates them into a larger vision that neither denies suffering nor is defeated by it. As Nietzsche observed, mature manhood, that means to have rediscovered the seriousness one had as a child at play. Finally, the process of transforming suffering into art requires active creation rather than passive endurance. It's not enough to simply experience pain. One must engage with it creatively, imposing form and meaning on what might otherwise remain chaotic and overwhelming. This is perhaps the most crucial insight Nietzsche offered. Suffering becomes transformative only when we respond to it with creative will. As evidence for this understanding continues to accumulate, a more complex picture emerges of the relationship between suffering and creativity, one that challenges our conventional approaches to both. As we examine more evidence across different domains and historical periods, a consistent pattern emerges that confirms Nietzsche's insight. Time and again, we find suffering transformed into creativity following a similar sequence. First comes the experience of pain or disruption that breaks established patterns. Then follows a period of disorientation and struggle. Finally, if the process is successful, emerges a creative response that doesn't merely escape from suffering, but transforms it into something meaningful and valuable. This pattern appears vividly in the lives of countless artists. Frida Kahlo, after suffering a devastating bus accident at age 18 that left her in lifelong pain, transformed her suffering into paintings of extraordinary power and originality. She wrote, "I paint myself because I am so often alone, and because I am the subject I know best." Her self-portraits didn't hide or minimize her pain, but incorporated it into images of striking beauty and honesty. A similar pattern appears in the life of Beethoven, who composed some of his most profound works after losing his hearing, perhaps the most devastating loss imaginable for a musician. His late string quartets, created in almost complete deafness, are widely regarded as among the most transcendent works in the classical canon. Far from being diminished by his suffering, Beethoven's creative power seemed to deepen through his encounter with it. The pattern extends beyond the arts into scientific discovery. Isaac Newton developed some of his most important mathematical insights during the plague year of 1665-66, when Cambridge University closed and he was forced into isolation. Charles Darwin formulated key aspects of his theory of evolution while suffering from a mysterious chronic illness. In each case, disruption and suffering created the conditions for breakthrough insight. Even in spiritual traditions that Nietzsche often criticized, we find this same pattern. The Buddha's enlightenment came after years of ascetic suffering. Jesus' crucifixion preceded resurrection. Countless mystics across traditions have described how their deepest spiritual insights emerged from periods of intense suffering or the dark night of the soul. What these diverse traditions share is the recognition that transformation often passes through suffering rather than around it. Nietzsche himself exemplified this pattern. During the summer of 1881, while enduring one of his most physically painful periods, he experienced the insight that would become the cornerstone of his later philosophy, the concept of eternal recurrence. In a letter describing this moment, he wrote, "I walked beside the lake of Silvaplana through the villages, in tears from the fullness of happiness as I had this thought, and this is the greatest weight." His physical suffering had become the catalyst for a profound philosophical breakthrough. What makes this pattern particularly significant is that it appears to operate at multiple levels simultaneously: individual and cultural, psychological and historical. Just as individuals transform personal suffering into creative expression, entire civilizations respond to collective trauma through cultural renaissance. The flowering of Athenian tragedy followed the devastating Persian Wars. The Renaissance emerged in the aftermath of the Black Death. The vibrant culture of 1920s Paris developed in the shadow of World War I. This multi-level consistency suggests something fundamental about the relationship between suffering and creativity. As Nietzsche intuited, this isn't merely a psychological quirk or a romantic myth about tortured artists. It's a basic pattern in how human beings and human cultures evolve and develop. The philosopher captured this in his famous aphorism, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." This statement isn't about mere survival or resilience, but about transformation, about how encounters with suffering can catalyze new growth and creation. Even in contemporary psychology, we find confirmation of this pattern in concepts like post-traumatic growth, the recognition that traumatic experiences, while painful, can lead to profound positive change in some individuals. Researchers have identified increased creativity as one of the common positive outcomes following successfully processed trauma. What science is now documenting empirically, Nietzsche recognized through philosophical insight and personal experience. The pattern is clear. Suffering, when engaged with creatively rather than merely endured, can become the catalyst for our most profound expressions and insights. But this understanding raises deeper questions. Why do some people manage to transform their suffering into creativity, while others remain trapped in it? And why has our culture been so resistant to recognizing the potential value of pain? The implications of Nietzsche's insight about suffering and creativity extend far beyond art or philosophy. They challenge our fundamental understanding of what constitutes a good human life, and how we should approach our inevitable encounters with pain. If suffering can indeed be the catalyst for our deepest creative expressions, then we must reconsider many of our basic assumptions. First, this understanding transforms how we might approach suffering itself, not as a meaningless obstacle to be eliminated as quickly as possible, but as a potentially significant experience that demands engagement. Nietzsche wasn't suggesting we seek out suffering or romanticize it, but rather that when pain inevitably arrives, we have options beyond mere endurance or escape. As he wrote in The Gay Science, "I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things. Then I shall be one of those who make things beautiful." This perspective doesn't deny the reality of suffering or minimize its difficulty, but it does offer a different relationship to it. Rather than asking only, "How can I end this pain?" we might also ask, "What might this experience reveal? How might it transform me? What might I create from it?" These questions don't replace appropriate medical, psychological, or social responses to suffering, but they add a dimension that's often missing from contemporary approaches. Second, Nietzsche's insight challenges our cultural idealization of comfort and security. Modern society is organized largely around the elimination of discomfort and the pursuit of ease. Our consumer products, entertainment options, and even many of our psychotherapeutic approaches aim primarily at making us feel better. Yet if Nietzsche is correct, this single-minded pursuit of comfort may inadvertently be limiting our creative potential and depth. As he provocatively stated in The Will to Power, "The discipline of suffering, of great suffering. Do you not know that it is this discipline alone that has created all enhancements of man so far?" This doesn't mean we should abandon the genuine advances that have reduced unnecessary suffering, but it does suggest we might be more selective about which discomforts we seek to eliminate and which we might engage with creatively. Third, this perspective offers a profound alternative to victim narratives that can sometimes trap people in their suffering. Instead of seeing those who suffer as merely passive recipients of misfortune deserving only pity, the Nietzschean view recognizes their potential for creative transformation. This shift from passive victim to active creator can be psychologically empowering, offering a path forward that neither denies the reality of suffering nor remains defined by it. As Nietzsche wrote in Ecce Homo, "I do not want to be a holy man, sooner even a buffoon. Perhaps I am a buffoon." This willingness to transform even his most serious suffering through creative play exemplifies the liberating potential of his approach. It suggests that we might relate to our own pain not with solemn reverence or bitter resentment, but with the creative irreverence that turns lead into gold. Fourth, this understanding has implications for how we approach mental health and emotional well-being. Many contemporary therapeutic approaches aim primarily at returning people to normal functioning and eliminating symptoms of distress. But the Nietzschean perspective suggests that some forms of psychological struggle might be potentially valuable if engaged with creatively rather than merely pathologized. This doesn't mean abandoning effective treatments for mental illness or suggesting that serious conditions like clinical depression are somehow beneficial. Rather, it means recognizing that human psychological experience exists on a spectrum, and that some forms of emotional intensity or disturbance might contain creative potential alongside their difficulty. Finally, Nietzsche's insight offers a profound response to the problem of meaning in modern life. In a world where traditional sources of meaning have been eroded, the capacity to transform suffering into creativity provides a powerful alternative to either blind faith or nihilistic despair. As he wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, creating, that is the great salvation from suffering and life's alleviation. This creative response to suffering doesn't depend on external authorities or metaphysical guarantees. It's available to anyone willing to engage actively with their own experience. This may be Nietzsche's most significant contribution, showing that even in a world without transcendent meaning, we can still create meaning through our creative response to suffering. But this raises the question, if this understanding is so valuable, why has it been so consistently overlooked or actively suppressed? The systematic marginalization of Nietzsche's insight about suffering and creativity isn't accidental. It reflects powerful forces that have shaped our civilization's relationship to pain and art. These forces operate not through deliberate conspiracy, but through interconnected cultural, economic, and psychological patterns that consistently privilege comfort over transformation, consumption over creation, and immediate relief over meaningful engagement with suffering. Consider first how modern capitalism depends on a particular relationship to discomfort. Consumer culture functions by creating a cycle of desire and temporary satisfaction, promising that the next purchase will eliminate some discomfort or provide some pleasure. This system has little use for individuals who might transform their suffering into meaning rather than trying to shop it away. As Nietzsche presciently observed in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the marketplace and its shameless tradesfolk will speak, everything for me. In such a marketplace, the Nietzschean approach to suffering represents a threat to consumption-based identity. This economic pattern is reinforced by pharmaceutical approaches to emotional pain. The medicalization of suffering, classifying more and more forms of human distress as disorders requiring chemical intervention, creates an environment where the default response to pain is to suppress it rather than engage with it. While psychiatric medications are essential and life-saving for many conditions, our culture's increasing reliance on pharmaceutical solutions for ever wider ranges of human suffering reflects a broader unwillingness to see pain as potentially meaningful. Religious institutions, too, have often contributed to misunderstanding the relationship between suffering and creativity. While many religious traditions contain profound wisdom about transformative suffering, think of Christ on the cross or Buddha under the Bodhi tree, institutional religion has frequently reduced this complexity to simplistic narratives of suffering as either divine punishment or a test of faith to be endured for future reward. Nietzsche saw how these approaches could prevent genuine creative engagement with pain, writing in The Antichrist. Christianity was from the beginning, essentially and fundamentally, life's nausea and disgust with life, merely concealed behind, masked by, dressed up as faith in another, or better life. Even the art world itself has participated in obscuring the connection between suffering and creativity. The commercial art industry often separates artists' work from their lived experience, presenting creations as commodities divorced from the conditions of their making. Meanwhile, academic approaches to art frequently emphasize formal analysis or social context while downplaying the transformative personal processes that generate creative work. The result is a sanitized view of creativity that makes it difficult to understand how suffering might be essential to artistic production. Educational systems similarly tend to present creative achievements as the products of talent, technique, or inspiration, while minimizing the role of struggle and suffering. Students learn about Mozart's musical genius, but less about his financial troubles and early death. They study Virginia Woolf's innovative novels, but get little sense of how her mental health challenges shaped her unique perspective. This selective storytelling creates the impression that great art emerges despite suffering rather than through creative engagement with it. Perhaps most pervasively, our psychological default settings work against Nietzsche's understanding. Humans naturally seek to avoid pain and maximize pleasure. It's a basic evolutionary mechanism. Engaging creatively with suffering requires overriding this default, something that doesn't come easily or naturally. As Nietzsche wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, there is a point in the history of society when it becomes so pathologically soft and tender that among other things it sides even with those who harm it, criminals, and does this quite sincerely and honestly. This pathological softness reflects our increasing unwillingness to see value in any form of suffering. Social media amplifies these tendencies, creating environments where curated happiness is rewarded, while authentic engagement with difficulty is often met with superficial responses or ignored entirely. The constant pressure to present positive, successful versions of ourselves leaves little space for the messy, difficult process of transforming suffering into creativity. As Nietzsche might have predicted, our most public forums have become showcases for what he called the spirit of gravity, the solemn self-importance that prevents playful, creative responses to life's difficulties. The combined effect of these forces is a culture that systematically misunderstands and devalues the connection between suffering and creativity that Nietzsche identified. But this raises a deeper question. Why are we so resistant to recognizing the potential value in pain? What psychological and existential factors drive our collective avoidance of Nietzsche's insight? The deepest reasons for our resistance to Nietzsche's understanding of suffering and creativity lie in the fundamental human struggle with finitude, vulnerability, and mortality. To fully embrace the Nietzschean approach requires confronting aspects of existence that we're instinctively programmed to avoid. Not just physical pain, but the more profound existential challenges of being human. At the core of this resistance is our difficulty accepting the tragic dimension of life. The recognition that suffering isn't an accident or deviation, but an inherent aspect of human existence. Modern culture has increasingly promoted what we might call the therapeutic worldview, the belief that with the right techniques, technologies, or social arrangements, we could eliminate suffering entirely and create lives of uninterrupted happiness and fulfillment. This view has roots in Enlightenment optimism, but has accelerated dramatically in consumer societies. Nietzsche saw through this illusion with remarkable clarity. In The Birth of Tragedy, he wrote, "The Greek knew and felt the terror and horror of existence. That he might endure this terror at all, he had to interpose between himself and life, the radiant dream birth of the Olympians." The Greeks, in Nietzsche's view, understood something we've forgotten, that the tragic aspect of existence can't be eliminated, but must be confronted and transformed through creative expression. This forgetting isn't accidental. It serves important psychological functions, protecting us from the full awareness of our vulnerability and mortality. Ernest Becker, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death, argued that much of human culture functions as an elaborate defense mechanism against the terror of mortality. Our resistance to Nietzsche's insight about creative suffering can be understood as part of this larger pattern of death denial. because to engage deeply with suffering is to approach the boundaries of our existence, to confront our finitude. Moreover, the Nietzschean approach demands a level of personal responsibility that many find frightening. If suffering can be transformed through creative engagement, then we bear some responsibility for how we respond to our pain. As Nietzsche wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, the discipline of suffering, of great suffering, do you not know that it is this discipline alone that has produced all enhancements of man so far? This discipline isn't passive endurance but active engagement, a demanding stance that offers neither the comfort of victimhood nor the escape of distraction. There's also a social dimension to this resistance. Nietzsche's approach to suffering is inherently individualistic, emphasizing personal creative response rather than collective solutions. This runs counter to both traditional religious communities, which offer shared narratives about suffering, and modern therapeutic cultures, which offer standardized approaches to pain. The Nietzschean path is necessarily lonely, as he acknowledged. One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. This loneliness is another aspect we seek to avoid. Perhaps most challengingly, Nietzsche's understanding requires us to abandon the comforting belief that suffering happens for a reason or serves some predetermined purpose. In a post-religious age, many still cling to secularized versions of divine providence, the idea that pain must serve some larger plan or purpose beyond our understanding. Nietzsche rejected this entirely. Suffering has no inherent meaning. Whatever significance it acquires comes only through our creative response to it. As he wrote in The Gay Science, what alone can our teaching be? That no one gives a human being his qualities, not God, not society, not his parents or ancestors, not he himself. No one is accountable for existing at all, or for being constituted as he is, or for living in the circumstances and surroundings in which he lives. This radical contingency, the recognition that suffering doesn't happen for any reason, creates what philosophers call the problem of evil in secular form. Without divine justice or cosmic purpose, how do we make sense of pain? Nietzsche's answer, that we create meaning through artistic transformation, places an enormous burden on human creativity. It's often easier to cling to fading religious frameworks or adopt simplified therapeutic narratives than to embrace this creative responsibility. Finally, there's the uncomfortable fact that not all suffering can be successfully transformed into creativity. Some pain is so extreme, so devastating, that it destroys rather than catalyzes creative potential. Nietzsche himself eventually succumbed to mental illness that ended his productive work. His famous statement, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger," contains an important qualification. Some suffering does kill, or damages beyond repair. Acknowledging this limit case forces us to confront the genuine tragedy of existence in ways that simplified narratives about suffering avoid. For all these reasons, Nietzsche's profound insight about the relationship between suffering and creativity has remained culturally marginalized, too threatening to our psychological defenses, too challenging to our desire for guaranteed meaning, too individual for our collective solutions. And yet, for those willing to engage with it, this understanding offers a powerful alternative to both religious consolation and nihilistic despair. The final question isn't whether suffering can become art. The evidence for this transformation is overwhelming. The question is whether you're willing to develop a new relationship with the pain in your own life, to see it not merely as an obstacle to be overcome, but as the potential raw material for your most meaningful creations. What Nietzsche offers isn't just a philosophical theory, but a practical approach to existence, one that neither denies the reality of suffering, nor remains passive before it. One must learn to dance upon the volcano of life, he tells us. This image perfectly captures the essence of his insight, not escaping the volcano, not being consumed by it, but learning to dance upon it, transforming danger and pain into creative movement. The practical implications of this understanding are profound and far-reaching. When you encounter suffering, whether physical pain, emotional distress, or existential crisis, you have choices beyond mere endurance or escape. You can engage with your suffering creatively, asking not just, "How can I make this stop?" but, "What might this experience reveal? How might it transform me? What might I create from it?" This doesn't mean romanticizing pain or seeking out suffering. Nietzsche wasn't advocating masochism or the glorification of tragedy for its own sake. He was recognizing that suffering, being an inevitable aspect of human existence, presents us with a fundamental choice. We can be diminished by our pain, or we can transform it through creative engagement, as he wrote in Twilight of the Idols, from life's school of war. What does not kill me makes me stronger. This strength isn't mere endurance, but creative power, the ability to shape meaning from even our most difficult experiences. The transformative process Nietzsche describes isn't easy or automatic. It requires specific qualities: honesty to face your suffering directly, rather than denying or minimizing it; courage to remain open to the full intensity of the experience, rather than numbing yourself; discipline to channel raw pain into structured expression, rather than formless emotional release; and perhaps most importantly, what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate, the capacity to affirm life, not despite its painful aspects, but with them fully included. I've observed in my exploration of this topic that those who most successfully transform suffering into creativity share certain practices. They create regular time and space for creative expression, whether through writing, music, visual art, or other forms. They develop communities that support honest engagement with difficult experiences rather than enforcing toxic positivity. They cultivate both technical skills to give form to their expression and philosophical perspectives to find meaning in their suffering. And they approach their creative practice not as a mere hobby or profession, but as an essential aspect of their humanity, their unique way of dancing on the volcano. If you've recognized moments in your own life where pain has led to creation, where suffering has deepened your understanding or catalyzed your expression, I invite you to share that experience in the comments. Your testimony might illuminate the path for others facing their own creative struggles with suffering. And if this perspective has shifted how you view the difficulties in your life, consider leaving a like as a signal that you're part of this community of philosophical investigators who are willing to look beneath conventional narratives to discover deeper truths about the human condition. The community we're building here isn't about passive consumption of ideas, but active engagement with life's fundamental questions. By subscribing and activating the notification bell, you're joining a group of modern Nietzscheans who aren't satisfied with simplified approaches to either art or suffering, who are willing to explore the complex territory where pain becomes beauty. Remember Nietzsche's profound insight: art begins where pain finds its rhythm. Your suffering isn't punishment or meaningless accident. It's the raw material for your unique creation. The question isn't whether you'll experience pain. It's what you'll create from it. From suffering, we create. Not because pain itself is good or desirable, but because the human capacity for creative transformation is so extraordinary. Because we can take what appears most destructive and fashion from it something meaningful, beautiful, even transcendent. As Nietzsche wrote in his final productive years, "I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things. Then I shall be one of those who make things beautiful." This isn't passive acceptance, but active creation. The art of making beauty from necessity, meaning from suffering, music from noise. The volcano of life will erupt. The question is, will you learn to dance?